In the book of Revelation, there's this absolutely terrifying vision of a monstrous army. It describes a plague of locusts, but with human faces and wearing armor of iron. Now, for centuries, it's been seen as this scary prophecy of something supernatural. But what if it wasn't a vision of the future at all? What if it was actually a coded description of one of the most brutal and efficient military forces the world had ever seen? In this explainer, we're diving into a fascinating theory, that this apocalyptic swarm was in fact the Roman legion. So listen to this description. The author talks about an army of locusts that are just completely unnatural. They're shaped like war horses, they have the faces of men, and they're covered in what looks like armor. And can you just imagine the sound? The text says their advance was like the thunder of 1,000 chariots all charging into battle at once. Yeah, this isn't just a plague, it's a vision of pure military horror. So what on earth could this actually be? It's really easy to read this and just think, okay, this is purely symbolic, some demonic force from another world. But there's this fascinating historical interpretation that argues the author wasn't looking into the future. No, he was describing something he could literally see, or had heard terrifying reports about, happening in his own time. Okay, so let's start with that central image, this absolute plague of locusts. The whole idea behind this interpretation is that these so-called locusts aren't insects at all. They're a metaphor for the 80,000 Roman troops under General Vespasian marching on Jerusalem. I mean, try to picture it. You're standing on a hill in Judea around 70 AD. You look out, you don't see a swarm of insects, you see the dust and the smoke of the Roman war machine, a massive advancing tide of soldiers that would look for all the world like a devouring plague. To really decode this vision, we have to ground ourselves in the history of the time, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was the brutal, bloody climax of the First Jewish-Roman War, a conflict that would literally change the course of history. And this timeline here, it's absolutely crucial. By 70 AD, the whole situation was just explosive. Vespasian had just been named emperor back in Rome, so he leaves his son, Titus, to finish the job in Judea. What happens next is a brutal 5-month siege of Jerusalem, an agonizing ordeal of starvation, internal fighting, and unbelievable violence that ends with the city being totally destroyed. This trauma is the backdrop for Revelation's locust army. Okay, and this is where the theory gets really compelling. We're going to break down the description from Revelation piece by piece and see just how uncannily it matches the gear and the appearance of a first-century Roman soldier. The vision starts right at the top. The locusts have something on their heads that shines like golden crowns. Now, that's a pretty strange detail for an insect, but maybe not for a soldier. So the interpretation here is that these crowns are actually the Roman Galea, that iconic military helmet. Now, just picture it for a second. Tens of thousands of these polished bronze or iron helmets, glittering under the Middle Eastern sun. From a distance, to somebody filled with terror, they would absolutely look like an army of kings wearing crowns of gold. All right, this next one is even more specific, and frankly, a little bizarre. Hair, like women's hair, on a monstrous locust horse creature? What's that about? Well, the likely answer is the horsehair crests that Roman officers, especially the centurions, wore on their helmets. These long, often dyed plumes would flow behind them as they moved, creating this striking image from a distance that, could easily be described as long, flowing hair. And then the description gets even more ferocious. They have the teeth of lions. I mean, that just evokes this sense of terrifying power, the ability to just tear and destroy everything in their path. And once again, the answer might actually be on the Roman helmet. The hinged cheek guards, called buculi, came right down along the jawline, basically framing the soldier's mouth with metal. From a distance, that metal framework around a grim-faced soldier's mouth, you can see how that could evoke the terrifying image of a lion's powerful jaw. Okay, this next detail from the text, this one might be the most direct and least symbolic one of all. It's almost spelled out for us. This is a direct hit. The Roman legionaries' main armor was the lorica segmentata, which is literally a breastplate made of overlapping iron strips. The text says breastplates of iron, and the Romans wore breastplates of iron. This is probably the most straightforward one-to-one comparison in the entire passage. You can't really argue with it.
So we've pretty much decoded the soldier, but we all know every army has a leader, and the leader of this locust army is given a very specific and very, very ominous name. The text tells us their king is the angel of the bottomless pit, and get this, he has two names, one in Hebrew and one in Greek. Now that's a really significant detail in a multicultural world like the Roman Empire. And what do these names mean? Well, it's totally unambiguous. Whether you're a Hebrew speaker or a Greek speaker, the message is exactly the same. The one leading this army is the destroyer. So who is this destroyer? Well, the traditional spiritual interpretation would point to some kind of supernatural entity, like Satan or a really powerful demon. But if this army is indeed Roman, then who's its leader? For the people of Judea in 70 AD facing total annihilation, who else could the destroyer possibly be but the Roman general in command, either Vespasian, who started it all, or his son Titus, who finished the job? And here it is, one final kind of mind-blowing connection. The text describes these locusts as having tails with stings like scorpions. Well, it turns out the name of the general who began the invasion, Vespasian, is believed to be related to the Latin word for, get this, a wasp, a stinging insect. It's this almost unbelievable wordplay, connecting the general himself directly to the tormenting imagery of the vision. So, when you start putting all of these pieces together, a completely new picture starts to emerge. What we're left with is a coherent and really powerful argument. A vision that seems purely fantastical can be systematically decoded using the historical reality of the Roman-Judean War. The golden crowns are the helmets, the flowing hair is the plumes, the iron breastplates are the armor, and even the leader, the destroyer, points to the Roman general. It all just aligns. And this all brings us to a huge final thought. This interpretation really challenges us to think differently about apocalyptic writing. What if we're not always looking at a blueprint for the distant future? What if, sometimes, we're actually looking at a reflection, painted in the vivid, symbolic language of trauma, of a world-ending event that had already happened?